Okay, today I want to talk about HTML forms, and I want to talk about how we can use JavaScript to interact with the form, to validate the form, do other things like that. So I've built a HTML file. I'm going to leave a copy of the HTML and the JavaScript as code gists linked to in the comments for you so you can follow along as I'm doing this. I've built, to save some time, I've pre-built an HTML form here. And typical pattern that you'll see in HTML is that you've got a div or some sort of element like a list item or a paragraph, these block elements that wrap around each one of the pairs. So inside of here I've got a label and then an input, a label and an input, a label, an input, a label, a select tag, a label, a checkbox, and then another div at the bottom here with two buttons in it. Doesn't really matter what the form element is, this is kind of the common pattern that you'll see. So I have, for each one of these containers, there's a class called formBox, and that defines how much space you have for each one of these things and make sure they stack and align properly. We can use this box to put the same padding or margin down the side to make sure they all align, and we can line up these elements here. So I'm not going to go into the CSS too much. You'll see, you can take a look at the CSS and see how that works. I want to focus on the scripting. So we have a for attribute inside each one of these labels, and the for is intended to match the ID for each one of the inputs or the select. That's how they bind together. So if I'm in my web page here and I click on the label, you'll see I get focus on that field. That's the whole idea behind adding this for. Type, we've got text, I've got a password, I've got type equals email, so three different kinds here. This one right here, the email, if you are using the built-in validation that you get in the browser, it will look for a string followed by an @ sign and then another string, and that's all the validation that you're going to get. So it will encourage somebody to add in a proper email address, but it's not going to be a really good check. So if I said xx@xx, it would accept that as a valid email address. Now I'm going to be scripting to override the defaults here. You can add things like required into an input, and then if you're using the default validation that comes with the browser, it will not let you submit the form until this field has been filled out, or every field that has a required attribute has been filled out. Placeholders, that's the text the user sees before they start typing inside of it. And if you want there to be a default value, you can type in an attribute value and set it equal to what you want to appear here, and then it's actual text that the person can edit. In our JavaScript, we're going to be accessing these properties, we're going to be looking at them, so we're going to be able to say, okay, hey, the input, what's its type? There's an attribute called type, and then in JavaScript there's a property called type for this element. This element has a type property set to password, this one's got a type set to email. The ID, all these attributes that we have inside here, we're going to be able to use that in JavaScript. So let's take a look here at the bottom. Last thing before we jump into the JavaScript, we've got a couple of buttons. Their ID set to button cancel, button send. The IDs are important. What's important is that you give them IDs and that the names make sense so that you can recognize the names when you're typing them inside of your JavaScript. All right, I have my JavaScript attached. Inside my JavaScript, I have a handful of functions. I'm listening for the DOM content loaded event as always, and I'm going to call a function. Once the page is loaded, once the page and the script have loaded, this will run, and I'm adding click listeners onto the cancel and send button. Calling the cancel button is going to call the function reset, and the send is going to call the send function. So let's look at reset first. It's much simpler. If I do absolutely nothing with this, what's going to happen is the event is going to travel from the click on the button. So coming in here, I click on cancel. Because it's set to required, it's asking me to fill something in here. But the cancel button by default is going to clear this out, set it back to the state it was when the page loaded. And so if you're doing nothing else, if you've got no other requirements set on your form, you click on the cancel button, it is going to reset the field. Now we have to have the we have to use an input type equals reset. Instead of a button, we could say input type is reset, and then it's going to do that automatic resetting. I don't want to do that. I want to use just these buttons, and I'm going to be controlling it myself. So inside of here, I am going to say ev prevent default to make sure that this isn't going to try to submit the form or run the validation that's built into the browser. So I'm saying, hey, forget what you were normally going to do. I'm going to tell you what to do, and that is this. This is the ID of the form element that contains all of these. So there's one form element wrapped around all of these things, and I'm calling the reset method. That is going to put them back to the initial state when the page loaded. So if I save that, I come back inside here, type some gibberish, and then I click cancel. There we go. Now I've reset the form. It's back to its initial state. If I had put something in the value, so up inside here in my first name, if I had put something inside here and I said Ricky, there it is showing up automatically. I do that, cancel, it puts it back to the initial state when the page loaded. So this value is here, I don't get to see the placeholder, which I do want to see, so I'm going to remove that from here. So I'm back to seeing my placeholder. Now when the user clicks and they start typing, the placeholder disappears. My reset puts it back. Great, reset done. That's all there is to it. Now for the send, we want to do some sort of validation, typically. Now we can just rely on the built-in required, but usually you want to do a little bit more than what the built-in validation is going to do. So I'm going to prevent default, which means I take the click, I tell the browser don't pass the click event up to the form, which makes the form submit, stop it dead in its tracks. So prevent default isn't going to do what the button normally does. We can, if we want, call ev stop propagation to make sure it doesn't bubble up as well, but prevent default will work just fine. I'm going to have a function called validate. This is where I'm going to do all my validation work. I put it in its own function so I could call it from someplace else if I wanted to. The result that comes back from here, most often I'll use a Boolean, so it'll be a true or false value coming back from here. And then I check. And if the return was true, we can say that we want the form. So document get element by ID and its ID right here, form user, dot submit. Done. That's all there is to it. This will actually submit the form to whatever the action is inside the form element. So we're just submitting to the same page right now. It's not actually going anywhere. But if I save this and I come back in here, you can see there's no pound sign up here. If I click send, oh, my validation that I have is running, and it's putting an error message inside here. But if it did come back with a good to go, so at the bottom of this function, I'm just going to say return true. So I'm calling validate. Doesn't matter what this is doing, it's just going to return true always, which means this is going to run and submit my form. Send. There we go. And there's the hash mark. So it was sent to this address. Okay, great. So that's working. Now another alternative, if you're comfortable working with promises, if you needed to do something that was asynchronous, so a fetch call to the server, you wanted to do validation to make sure the person's username that they typed into your form is not already taken. Maybe you have a fetch call set up that you can call to the server and say, hey, is this username already taken? If so, pass me back a message telling me that. If not, pass me back a message telling me that it's free, it's valid, it's good to use. So we can use a promise here, and then instead of using the return value with the if-else statement, we'd use then if it worked, catch if the promise failed, and inside the then we can check to see, hey, what was the value that came back from the server on that promise? Did it work? Did it not work? So we can have a series of promises that we call for these multiple fetches to validate things, to submit things to the server. We can do all that sort of thing. Inside here, I just want to talk about some of the basic validation. I'm going to work with a Boolean, coming back saying true or false. I'm going to do some basic validation. So let's look and see what we can do here. Input alive. This is my checkbox. Checkboxes, I'm saving mine inside the variable check. This is the input right down here. This input type equals checkbox with the ID alive. It has a property called checked. Now this by default means that it's selected when the page loads. There's a little check mark inside of there. We can see it right here. That's nice, my Dropbox is full. So, little checkbox because this property is here. If I remove this property, it won't be checked when the page loads. The user can change that value though. And if I want to know what it is, we can make it pop up here. We'll say alert check.checked. So when I validate, oh, I'm getting an error here. Let's check that out. Go to our good friend the debugger. Cannot read property checked of null. Okay, so it did not like this thing. Input alive. What did I do in here? Oh, I just called it alive. I forgot the input in front of it. There we are. I'll come back and refresh this. Run it again. True. It is checked. Good. I'll go back. I'll unselect it. Check. False. There we go. So that is the checked property that we're getting from this element. Now, alerts can be very annoying. It's better to use console.log. But we can check and see if this is checked or if it's not. And we can change this variable here, valid. This is our flag, our Boolean to say, was the form good or was it not? Are we going to accept the data or are we not? I'm going to check here to see if check was checked. We're good to go. If it was not checked, so we'll flip the sign here to say if checked is false, then I'm going to set valid to false. Now, you can start off with true, assuming everything is good, and then as you find problems, set the Boolean to false, and then down here at the bottom, we'll pass back that variable. So we're passing back the Boolean. So if this is not checked, our form is not going to be validated. So if it is, it will try to submit. If it's not, this is where I'm displaying my error messages. So let me explain what I'm doing here. I'm finding something with the class error. Now I could, inside of here, said that I want to get the check box here. I'm going to go up to its parent div, and I'm going to add the CSS class error to its parent div. Let's take a look at that. Right here, class form box is the parent of the label and the checkbox. So if this thing's not checked, I'm going to go up to the div, and I'm going to add the class in here called error. And then I'm going to add a message like that inside of here. And that's what's going to happen is I'm going to get this thing appearing if I add the class error to the div, and whatever I'm putting as the message here, that's going to appear as the text. So remove that, and then inside here, what we're going to do is we're going to get the parent of the check. So parent element. Now I'm going to say class list add error. Parent element get, or rather set attribute, data error message is going to be, well, whatever I want to put inside of here. I can say that it's going to be, must be alive to submit. or something to that effect. So not checked, send, must be alive to submit. There we go. And this is the process that we're going to repeat. I have this one in here just as an example. We don't have to do it here. We could, instead of a Boolean, we have an option of creating an object inside of here. And each time something goes wrong, we can add something to that. So let failures equal an array. It's an empty array. And inside of here, we could say failures.push, add to the array an object where the input is going to be the one that is called input alive, and the message is going to be must be alive to submit. There we go. So we keep adding these failures every time something goes wrong, and then here, instead of just sending back valid, we can check, okay, if valid is true, then send back, or if valid is false rather, send back failures. Up here, we get the array. And then we can check, okay, is the length of the array, or if this thing is true, or false rather, and the array has something inside of it, or just check to see what the array length is. Maybe we could always send back failures, like that. Sending this array back up to here, we can check. So my fails, if fails dot length equals 0, we're good to go. We're good to submit. We can send this off to the server and not worry about a thing. Else, there are some errors to display. And then maybe this is the place where we do this thing and this thing. We take a loop through failures, and for each one of those we find the input and then we display the message inside of there. So we could loop through failures. So fails was the array right here that came back. And we'll say for each one is sending us an object. I'm going to use the arrow function syntax here. This could be a standard function if you're more comfortable with that. We can say, call this function like this. Same thing. Inside of here, I'm going to get from this object, there's a property called input and a property called message. So document query, or get element by ID, obj.input. That gives me the ID right here. So let's say let field equal that, and then field dot parent element dot class list add error field dot parent element dot set attribute and that's going to be obj.message. There we are. So for each failure, what we're doing instead here is we're doing this. Failures get set to a empty array, and then we're adding these objects in there. Every time there is a problem, we add the problem to the array. We get down to the end, we send back the array of problems. If the length of the array is 0, we're good to go. Otherwise, we loop. And each time this validate function is called, we're resetting the array, and we're rechecking everything that's inside of here. All right, so we save that, we come back here, deselect this. There we go. There was one thing in the array, one thing was displayed. Other things, the select. So with drop-down lists, the select, we have a whole bunch of properties that we can work with. There's selected index, which tells us the number, which one of the options was picked. Was it number 0, number 1, number 2, number 3? However many there are, the first one is 0, and then length minus 1 is the index of the last one. So we can find out that. We can find out selected value, which is really the same thing as value. It's what's the value of the one that is selected right now. Options, this is the array of all the options inside of there. Length tells us how many options there are. So a whole bunch of stuff we can find out inside here. Now, there's typically not too much that you want to validate with a drop-down list, but maybe there's something special that you want to display. Maybe the person has to be, over the age of 20, or we could change these numbers. Maybe over 18 was something, over 16, over 21 was something, and that's one of the entries. So we want to make sure that the selected index is not this one. So if select.selected index equals 0. So if it was the very first one, now we have a problem. So failures.push input is going to be the one called input age message too young. All right, now that's all we did. We just added this if statement and we pushed something into the array. We've already done the work of sending back the array. Let's try this out. So we've got the first one selected. Send. There we go. Both errors showing up. Now, these ones, first, last email. Actually, this one is not last. This is password. Copy and pasting earlier. There we go. Now we have value and default value. Default value is the value that was in the field when the page loaded. So when you reset, what you get back to, that is the default value. And value is what the user has typed. So we'll say if first dot value equals an empty string. I'm going to add an error inside of here. We'll say failures push. Create that object inside of here. Input is input first, and the message required field. All right, now for the other ones, we're basically repeating the same thing. We can do other things, like we can check the length of the value. So this is password. I'm going to say or password dot value dot length is less than 8. We'll say 8's the minimum length. Then there's a problem. And our last one was the email. There we are. Nothing's filled in. This is off. Boom, problem in every one of our fields. Now, there's other things that you can do with passwords and with email addresses. I was saying that the validation was pretty weak when it came to email addresses in the built-in browser one. So regular expressions. I'm going to make another video about regular expressions because that's a topic all on itself. But we want to put regular expressions inside of here, and the regular expression we'd use to check and see, okay, does the password have a number and an uppercase and a lowercase letter? We can check in the email address to see, are there at least 2 characters in front of the @ sign? Is there at least 2 characters between the @ sign and a period, and then at least 2 characters that come after the period? There's a whole bunch of things that we can check, and we can make regular expressions to do that. So I'll have another video on regular expressions where we talk about making patterns like that. But for now, this is the basics. You've got selects, you've got radio buttons, you've got checkboxes. The radio buttons and checkboxes use .checked, and they've got a .value as well, if you want to get at the value that's inside there. Right, oh, I don't have a value for that. I should have one, so something gets sent to the server. There we go. So it has a value that'll get sent to the server. Now inside of here, we're putting in the select. Select has a whole bunch of options that you can play with, and I encourage you to experiment with these different properties to see how they work and what values you get from them. And then there's text fields of all different kinds. There's also date fields and color fields and the range. They're all going to have a value property. The value property is going to give you what the user has selected, what the user has typed, what the user has picked. Then that is the value you want to compare against something. So simple if statements to compare what they've entered with, or what you want them to enter with, or not want them to enter, with the value that's actually inside there. Return your array. Back up to here. If the array length is 0, you're good to go. Otherwise, loop through it and come up with some sort of design pattern of your own where you're adding a CSS class and you're embedding what the problem is inside of the HTML. So inside of here, if I inspect this, go to the elements, get rid of this thing. Here we are. You can see, here's the div, class form box, and the class error was added, and then this field that I invented. This isn't a required name or anything, it's just a name that I made up. We're allowed to invent attributes as long as they start with data underscore hyphen. I've got another video about the data properties, dataset properties. I'll put a link to that in the comments if you're interested. And required field. That was the message that I wanted to display. All right, and that's it. If you have any questions, please leave in the comments. As always, thanks for watching.